Hello, listeners, from Roy Damari Vinsam, bringing you Easter greetings on this 1st of April, which also happens to coincide with the 100th year anniversary of the founding of the Royal Air Force. We shall be celebrating that at Holy Trinity Church on the 18th of April, a little bit late, but the important thing today is to wish all believers, and that comes from a believer, the faith we have that Easter really happened and that the Lord is with us today. Now, to turn to more secular matters. A few weeks ago, I started calling this program Roy's Ramblings, and I think today would make that title quite suitable. There's so much to talk about, and I may jump from one thing to the other. When it comes to the macroeconomic situation and the implications it has for our finances, I think it's worth noting this significant sea change in the macroeconomic situation. Obviously, Brexit is part of it. The relative success of Europe is part of it. The trade war, which is coming out slowly thanks to Donald Trump, is part of it, is a negative part of it, of course. And the whole policy of the Trump administration is an issue with its determination to create jobs without worrying about the debt. But worrying about the debt is precisely what is needed today, because it will have a major impact as we go forward and sort out the issue of interest rates and the growth of the GDP. In fact, policy over there in the USA is kind of push and pull, because the push is coming from the fiscal stimulus with a reduction in tax rates, and it's a case of, well, to heck with what that implies for the hugely growing debt of the United States government. But if the fiscal side is stimulating, the Fed side, the money side, is restrictive, because the Fed is convinced that they need to increase the short-end rate, the overnight rate, to levels which we haven't seen in many years. They are saying that there is a risk of inflation. They are saying that there is a lot of money awash in the economy. It needs to be charged for and perhaps retired from the economy. And that's a very different approach from the fiscal approach being taken by Trump and company. This, what I call push-pull effect, means that the stock market is up a bit and down a bit, quite volatile but going nowhere fast, and the GDP also is not really expanding at any significant rate, except again for consumer spending, which you can always increase by giving money away, but that is not a real basis for economic development. An effect of this push-pull strategy of the US government and federal bank is that the yield curve, I'll just remind you, you probably know, but just to remind you, that is the interest rate for government bonds over a period of several years, with the short end being what the Fed rate sets and the long end being what the market sets. And right now the Fed is increasing the short end, which it can control, but not the long end. The long end is going nowhere fast. If anything, it's going down. So we have a flattening of the yield curve, which is always an odd situation, probably rather bad news, and it explains why 3 or 4 weeks ago Harry Dent was recommending buying long-term bonds, treasury bonds or corporate bonds, because he did not see the inflation taking off and therefore did not see the long-term bonds as rising in their yields and therefore dropping in their price, and therefore they're a good buy. On the other hand, short-term bonds are of little interest at the moment, because they will go down in value each time that the Fed increases its rate. Now, this same increase in the rate has breathed a little life into a market which died some years ago, namely the money market. The money market is a place to put cash. If you've got money and you don't know what to do with it, then you enter the money market and you measure the timing of your investments in weeks or months rather than in years, as you do normally with bonds. The money market died because it could earn nothing. In fact, it was losing money, and people got back out of the money market perhaps less than they put in. And that is just on the cusp of changing. We're at the point now where the overnight rate is such that you can earn a bit with short-term cash investments in the United States. Now, that's not yet the situation in Europe or in Switzerland. I think it will eventually get there, but for the moment, cash is not very interesting here, except to say that at least it doesn't lose its value, as some of the long-term bonds do. So in this regard, we have to look to the USA to see the way things are going, and Europe will probably follow a few weeks or months later. But the folk who have invested so heavily in the stock market are beginning to be a little bit cheesed off at the lack of progress, and indeed the declines are coming about led by the high-tech sector, the megatech sector. We know of the scandal around Facebook and the use of private data for rather unpleasant political ends. But the trouble with Facebook has had a knock-on effect with other high-tech companies, and it appears especially that Amazon has also gone down a lot in its price of the stock, not least, by the way, because Amazon, unlike Facebook, is not really profitable, and the stock success is based much more on expecting it to be super in the future. A story, of course, which we heard some years ago with the dot-com bubble. Now, whether or not the stock market is going to bounce around but get nowhere fast, or whether it will actually endure a major fall-off, which is, of course, what Harry Dent would suggest will happen, is unknown to me. I do think there's a strong case for diversifying into cash and into bonds if and where you can find some that give you a positive return. Let me jump in my ramblings to Russia, which is a country of which I'm fond, not necessarily of its government, but of its people and its culture. It is tragic that they have lost people in that Siberian fire with children, and there's great irresponsibility involved there with people locking doors and turning off the alarm. Just dreadful. And as for the fight with the United Kingdom and its allies throughout the world, I just can't see how Putin and company can do this and then just deny it and not give any plausible explanation. So things are pretty bad, and it will take some months to come back to a sort of normal relationship and even make Russia the normal country which it was on the way to becoming until Putin decided he wanted to rebuild the power of the Soviet Union. Well, I don't know if any spies are listening to this talk, but I have to express extreme disappointment in the behaviour, but maintain hope that we can remain friends with the Russian people and continue to do business and educational things and cultural things with them. In fact, we are receiving here, through INSAM, a group of lady singers at the end of this month. So not all is lost, at least in cultural terms. But talking of Russia, I'd like to raise a historical point about which I learned in a conversation, rather a presentation made by a certain Eric Hursley, who is both a professor and also a historian of Russia. And he's written a book, which I bought, and once I've read it, I might come back to it in this program. He's talking about how the Far East, i.e. Siberia, but way beyond Siberia, was, we'll say, conquered by Russia, by the Western Russia we know in Moscow and St. Petersburg. And when it happened, in fact, it happened in the middle of the 16th century onwards. Of course, there were people already living in Siberia who were not Russian, and they were not very well treated, not as badly as the Red Indians in the United States. That is really to the shame of America for many hundreds of years to come. There was a better relationship with them. In fact, they helped. the Russians, who were gradually moving eastwards. Now, two issues came out already of the talk, never mind the book. First of all, what was the motive to attract people to the east? Was it trees? No. Was it gold? No. It was fur. They went out to kill animals and sell their fur. You can make a fortune bringing furs back to Moscow, to the west. Second question that Eric Ersley answered in his talk was, what was the means of transport? Did they have like caravans as they did in the United States? No, they went by boat because there are lots of rivers in Siberia and beyond. They basically mainly run north to south rather than across, but they would enter a river and go down it. They were very slow-moving rivers, so they'd be wide and slow-moving, deep, so boats could go. And the boats could even be dismantled and carried across to the next river by land. So that was the means of transport, and the technology was run by sailors. However, the people that were pushing them were the trappers who were catching these animals for their fur. And as they completely wiped out the population of the animals in a given region, they would then, go further east until they finally met the Pacific. And what's even more fascinating is that they went beyond the Pacific and they landed in Alaska. So Alaska became a Russian colony, but it had huge problems in maintaining this colony because it was so far away. If you wanted to give it instructions and get a return, you would have to wait 18 months. You can't really run an empire on that basis. So the Russians decided they'd get rid of it, and they sold it for $7 million. Actually, it was 7.2 million because they couldn't persuade Congress to give the okay without adding another couple of $100,000 that could be used as a bribe to Congress. Plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. It was a bit of a problem to whom they could sell Alaska. It had to be America because there was a common enemy at the time to America and to Russia, and that was the United Kingdom. So they didn't want to sell it there, even though the UK might have bought it and added it, Alaska that is, to Canada. Anyway, it's all fascinating stuff, and you may hear more from me when I've read the book. So I think I've rambled on enough, and I will speak to you again next week.